A luxury three-row crossover with an actual usable third row sounds totally logical, but for a variety of reasons, there aren't that many options in the United States, and those options don't sell as well as you might be thinking. Now, I am talking about actual usable third rows, like the one in this Cadillac XT6, not occasional use third rows that are only there in a limited number of trims, like we find in the Genesis GV80 or BMW X5, etc. In this segment, you might already know that the Acura MDX is the best seller, but did you know that the Volvo XC90 is actually the second best seller in the United States? In a segment that really ought to be a lot larger than it actually is, Cadillac's entry is the XT6. Size and price-wise, this slots between Cadillac's two-row XT5 and the much bigger Cadillac Escalade. Before I get hate mail about comparisons, let's talk about what the XT6 is and what it is not. This is not a competitor to the GLS or the X7. Those are a bit bigger and they're a great deal more expensive than this. The XT6 competes in a category that usually spans for most shoppers between about $49,000 to $50,000 on up to just over about $60,000. That's the bulk of the XT6's price range. This segment includes the MDX as the bestseller, the XC90, Q7, Lincoln Aviator, the XT6 here, Model X, QX60, and the Land Rover Discovery. And that's about it in terms of sales volume in order there. Somewhere in that segment is also the Land Rover Defender, but it's kind of sort of not the same thing. Also, the Jeep Grand Cherokee L could be considered in some trims a direct competitor to this XT6. Exactly where it falls on the sales chart, we don't know because Jeep won't tell us, but a lot of the trims, especially limited trim and above, are going to be in the same sort of price range and size range on the inside as the XT6. This is the kind of vehicle that's still easy to park in mainstream suburban or urban situations, but actually has a usable third row with a little bit of cargo area behind. Now up front, it certainly looks like a modern Cadillac with their latest shield grille here, individual elements like we find in a lot of luxury cars. I like Cadillac's design language. Always had a soft spot for it ever since they started calling it art and science, and even though they don't call it that anymore, it still reminds me a lot of those designs. Multi-module LED headlights are right here and this distinctive accent strip, but unlike the new Cadillac Lyriq, this is not the headlight. Those are definitely up here. At 198.8 inches long, the XT6 is almost exactly the same size as the MDX and the Lincoln Aviator, and about 4 inches longer than the Volvo XC90. Now, in terms of size difference, the big difference between this and the XC90 is primarily in bumper overhangs. The cabin on the inside is largely similar in terms of size. This is about 13 inches shorter than the Cadillac Escalade, 28 inches shorter than the Escalade ESV. So if you're looking for a Cadillac that's not going to break the budget, and it's a lot easier to park and less expensive, you want this. If you want a Cadillac with even more room and even more opulence on the inside, you are going to want the Escalade. Not only is that bigger on the outside, it is significantly bigger on the inside. The Escalade ESV has a huge amount of cargo room and an even more capable third row, but it's going to cost you an awful lot more. This particular XT6 has 20-inch wheels wrapped in 235/55 series rubber. These are a little bit narrower than you'll find in some of the European competition. As is the norm for a three-row crossover, styling in the XT6 is fairly conservative. We have a relatively upright rear hatch, full LED taillamp modules, although no amber turn signals. These are all red here. The center brake light, that's up here in the spoiler, as is the rear wiper that's tucked up right there under the spoiler. No ducks on the Cadillac logo, but right there behind that, we have the button for the power liftgate, and then at the bottom of the bumper, we have dual integrated exhaust tips. The XT6, very much like the QX60, feels a little bit trapped between worlds. The engine lineup is not quite as exciting as something like a supercharged Escalade or an AMG or an M model from the Germans, because the mission here is more focused on passenger carrying and interior practicality than it is on overt performance under the hood. So engine lineup-wise, power levels are pretty similar to the average compact luxury crossover, where over 300 horsepower is pretty easy to come by. The base engine in the XT6, that's a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, giving you 23 miles per gallon combined, 237 horsepower. You're only going to find that in the base trim. The rest of the XT6 lineup gets this engine. It's a 3.6-liter naturally aspirated V6 that produces 310 horsepower, 271 pound-feet of torque, and drops fuel economy down to 21 miles per gallon. Now, if you want a naturally aspirated V6 in your next luxury three-row crossover, you have incredibly few options, and this is one of them. The other one is, of course, the Acura MDX. Outside of that, the Lexus RX is going turbocharged only, and it's losing its third row for the next generation here. If you want a three-row Lexus, theoretically that's coming later, but don't expect it to have a naturally aspirated V6. As with most of the competition, but importantly not all of the competition, we have a driver's seat that's a little bit less adjustable than smaller luxury crossovers with similar price tags. This driver's seat, for instance, only has a two-way adjustable lumbar support, something that did surprise me. I would have expected a four-way lumbar support, but we do have a memory-linked powered tilt telescopic steering column. You will find more comfortable and more adjustable seats in the Acura MDX and top-end trims, the Volvo, the Audi, etc. But price for price, you're going to find pretty similar content in most of the competition. Now let's get to what the XT6 is all about, passenger carrying. Back here in the second row, this is a two-person second row, so captain's chairs in the outboard positions with individual armrests that fold down. These seats have a pretty decent amount of recline, and this large panoramic sunroof goes to just about there on my head. Plenty of legroom back here, about 4.5, 5 inches or so, and the second row does slide forward and backward to help you portion the space a bit more equitably in the rear. At 109.8 inches of combined legroom, that is front row plus second row plus third row, this is basically the same kind of legroom that you'll find in a Q7, an MDX, or an XC90, a bit more than we find in the QX60, even though that does look a bit boxier and a bit squarer, but you will find a hair more legroom in the Aviator or the Grand Cherokee L. If you're trying to decide between the XT6 and the Escalade in the Cadillac lineup, you should know that this is going to be a lot easier to get in and out of if you have mobility issues, and a lot easier to get child seats in and out of because of its relative height. Even though I'm sitting in a very upright position and this cabin feels like an SUV cabin, I'm significantly closer to the ground than in an Escalade, which is a body-on-frame vehicle. So that extra height makes it a little bit more awkward to get some people in and out, but if you want that higher driving position and that more truck-like feel, you're going to want the Escalade. You're also going to want the Escalade if you want a wider second row. So going over here to this side of the vehicle, you'll notice that we don't have much space here between these two captain's chairs. You will find significantly more in the larger and wider Escalade. And over here, even though this seat is all the way back in its tracks now, so is the front seat. I have about 3 inches of legroom left. You will find significantly more legroom in the Escalade. I'll talk about this a bit more in a second, but jumping into the third row is going to be a bit different depending on whether you're doing it on the right side or on the left side of the vehicle. That's because the two captain's chairs do not move in the same manner. This one over here on the passenger side allows you to leave a child seat latch anchored into place and still tilt and slide that seat forward and backward, and you cannot do that on the driver's side. Now, it's worth noting that you cannot do that on either side of an XC90 or an MDX or a Q7, etc., etc., etc. Really, just this and the QX60 are the only options in this segment that have that child seat practical feature. You even won't find that on an Escalade. So if you do have to get people into the back here, and you still need to have a child seat or a booster seat installed and keep that in position, this is going to be a lot easier than most of the competition, even though the third row is a little bit smaller. But it's still pretty comfortable. Sometimes vehicles feel a bit roomier than their numbers would otherwise indicate, and I think the XT6 is one of those vehicles. Now, if I try and put my head back there to the headrest, I do have to kind of scrunch down a little bit, but I actually can do that. And sitting in a more natural position, I have about 1 inch of headroom left. It's really just this area right there by the hatch where it ducks down a bit. I also have a surprising amount of legroom back here. This seat is not quite all the way back in its tracks, but it's pretty close. I can try and move it further back there. There we go. Now it's all the way back there. I have about 1/2 inch of legroom left, but a reasonable amount of footroom. They did make sure to give us just a little bit of space under the second row seats for the feet. Now, the XT6's third row is a two-person third row only, and logically it's really meant to be spending most of its time folded, so we have plenty of hard plastics back here, like around the armrest there, the cup holders, but we do have USB charge ports back here, 2 USB-C ports, one on either side, and air vents back here for the third row. There's a separate video out where I take a deeper dive into this, but this is what the driver's side second row seat looks like. You can see that when it's folded forward, the angle changes on the seat back, versus the passenger side captain's chair where that angle does not change, but instead the seat bottom cushion sort of drops to the floor and then tries to tuck under the passenger seat to some extent. That leaves the angle right here exactly the same as it was before you tried to fold the seat. This does change the amount of heft required to put the seat back into place, but it certainly makes this a lot more practical than on the driver's side of the seat. And don't worry, Cadillac says that the seat is weighted, so that way if there was a child in the child seat, it wouldn't just suddenly pop forward. You'd have to really want it, and you would certainly notice that there was a child seat latched into place. Also handy, even if you have to use the shoulder belt, as you might on some booster seat arrangements, as long as the booster seat is latch anchored into place and then you're using the shoulder belt, when the shoulder belt is disconnected, it will still function in that same manner. If you were hoping the XT6 would give you room for 6 and luggage for 6, you will be a bit disappointed. Behind this cargo door, we find just under 13 cubic feet of storage space, so this has a 0 score in my 24-inch roller bag test, although I was able to squeak 2 of these 22-inch roller bags back here and a little bit of extra luggage on either side because there is a bit of a cargo well under the load floor in the rear. You will find notably more storage space in the MDX. That's just over 18 cubic feet or so. That may not sound like a big difference, but that means that the MDX can actually squeeze 24-inch roller bags back here. Of course, if you want more cargo space, there is the Escalade, and that will give you a lot more space, or even more space if you get the long Escalade. But this is certainly the kind of vehicle where if you wanted to have a road trip away for 5 or 6, you're going to need to use the roof rack or tow a small trailer. With such a small storage well behind the third row, you might be thinking the spare tire is under the XT6. In fact, it is not. It is under this little panel at kind of a jaunty angle. It is a fairly small temporary spare. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that this is the top-end trim, so we have features like an upgraded headliner and, of course, this large panoramic moonroof in here that extends to almost the second-row passengers' heads. From this angle, you can see those ceiling-mounted air vents for the second row and the third row as well. The driver and the front passenger get height-adjustable shoulder belts and height-adjustable headrests. The upholstery in here is leather, and it's styled very much like the rest of the Cadillac lineup. It's a very distinctive look. The seat bottom and back cushions have perforations because these seats are both heated and ventilated. The upper portion of the door panel has lots of soft touch materials, including that stitched upper section, a bit of imitation suede to match what's going on the headliner, carbon fiber, etc. And this model has the upgraded Bose audio system, so we find different speaker grills right there just in front of the door handle. Now, I must say that the buttons and switches in here are the same as a lot of other GM vehicles, and for some reason Cadillac has received a lot of crap about that, and I always thought that was weird because I have a Audi Q5 in the driveway at the same time as this XT6, and guess what? It shares window switches with Volkswagen models. But for some reason, Audi doesn't get into the same sort of trouble that Cadillac does. I've always thought that was peculiar. Yes, the buttons and switches in here, whether we're talking about the ones in the dashboard or that power button there, the steering wheel buttons are pretty similar to other GM models, etc. But for me at least, so what? Again, Audi, Volkswagen, they share a lot, BMW Mini shares a lot, and Mercedes still shares a bunch of switchgear with Chrysler and Dodge vehicles. I've never found that to be a particular problem. Now, back to this. Up on the upper portion of the dash, we have stitched materials for this upper and lower two-tier section here. 2 large air vents right there in the middle, more carbon fiber, big stripe of that right across the dashboard, large air vents over there for the passenger. Over here on the passenger side, we find a large bin-style glove compartment. I was able to fit a larger tablet computer inside. Then we find the previous edition of Cadillac's touchscreen infotainment system. So not the Android-based systems that we find in the Lyriq or some of the other models that are now on sale, but a previous generation. This software is starting to show its age. It's definitely a bit more sluggish than what we find in the Lyriq, but it is still perfectly functional. And of course, it gives us CarPlay and Android Auto integration as well. There's the engine start-stop button over there, the controls for the dual-zone automatic climate control here. From the front, the rear climate zone is controlled via the touchscreen infotainment system, so that is the third zone there. Below these controls, we find a small storage cubby, a bit more stitched goods there. Some of the stitching quality is a bit inconsistent in this interior, I must say. Moving down from there, we find a slidey cover for these 2 large cup holders, a joystick-style shifter. There's an unlock button over here on the side. We pull back for drive or manual, push forward for reverse, park is the button on top. We then find a controller for that touchscreen infotainment system. You can either touch the screen or use the controller. It's entirely your choice. Behind the cup holders, we find the drive mode button. We then have a softly padded center armrest that opens to reveal a moderately sized storage compartment. There is a removable tier and also USB ports in there, which is a nice touch. Over here, we have a Qi wireless charging slot. You can definitely stick those larger phones right in there. On the driver's side, we have a partial LCD instrument cluster. I do think that's a shame because Cadillac has some of the most attractive full LCD clusters in the business. In the center, we have our pretty typical trip computer readouts and then tachometer and speedometer on the outside. Like the Escalade, the XT6 has available Cadillac Super Cruise, so we have a little sensor right there for driver monitoring and this light bar on the steering wheel. This changes colors to tell you that the autonomous driving system is available or it's in operation. This is the only hands off the wheel, eyes on the road system in this segment. If you want to do road tripping across America, have the vehicle stay right there in the center of its lane without you touching the wheel at all, this is the only option going at the moment. On the outboard sides of the steering wheel, we find controls for the radar, adaptive cruise control, also voice command buttons, more of that carbon fiber going on right down there, stitched airbag cover, which is a nice touch. We don't even find that in some more expensive models in this segment, and then controls for the infotainment system over here on this side. On the back of the steering wheel, we do find paddle shifters down on the left, and then we have up over here on the right. I know I've said affordable a few times in this video, or at least not quite as expensive as some of the alternatives, but I should say that this particular XT6 has about $16,000 worth of options on it. That means that the MSRP on this model is about $72,000. So that is pretty high. Keep that in mind as we run through the comparisons here. 0 to 60 happened in this model in 6.4 seconds. You will certainly find faster alternatives out there, but as far as most of the competition goes, this is right in keeping with it. So 0 to 60 times in the regular T6 version of the XC90, the Acura MDX with the regular V6 engine, etc., all right in line here. But there are more powerful versions available, and this is the most power you can get in the XT6. The turbocharged model is going to be a little bit slower. Something like the plug-in hybrid XC90, it is particularly fast at 455 horsepower, and the Lincoln Aviator, it has a twin-turbo V6 standard in every version. Of course, there's also the plug-in hybrid with even more oomph if you want that. 6 to 0 stopping distance, this is pretty average, 120 feet. I'd actually expected it to be a little bit longer because these tires are not as wide as the tires that we find on some of the competition. But some of those European competitors will stop a little bit shorter. When it comes to handling, I would describe the XT6 as perfectly confident, but that's not quite as exciting as Cadillac's sedan lineup, which I would describe as excellent. You see, there's a bit of a divide here. The XT4, XT5, and XT6 are all front-wheel drive based vehicles. The CT4 and CT5, those are rear-wheel drive vehicles with absolutely sharp handling capability. This feels very similar to the MDX or the QX60, which is not to say bad, but it is to say not as sharp as an X5 or the Genesis GV80 or a Mercedes-Benz GLE, etc. Now, depending on the price tag, that could be a problem or not, because again, this one came in at $72,000. So there are certainly X5s and GLEs within the pricing envelope of this XT6. And that can be a bit of a problem, but we'll talk about that in the pricing and comparison video. Handling in the XT6 is also not as sharp as the MDX Type S with its turbocharged engine and the torque vectoring rear axle, or the Volvo XC90 with its double wishbone suspension up front, and certainly more of a European tune to the suspension. As you might expect out of a Cadillac on a rougher road surface like the one that I'm on here, even this model with 20-inch wheels and tires does a pretty decent job of soaking up those small bumps and large bumps. This is not a floaty boaty ride, but it's also not as firm as some of the European competition. Regardless of whether we're talking about the Volvo or the Audi or the Mercedes or the BMW, most of them are going to be firmer than this. That means that this is going to be a lot more comfortable on longer highway journeys, but if you're looking for the sharpest vehicle, obviously you might want to look towards one of those other options. Ride quality in the XT6 is substantially similar to the Lincoln Aviator or the Jeep Grand Cherokee L, but there are alternatives in this segment that have adaptive air suspensions available that are going to take things to the next level in terms of comfort. But you should know that outside the Grand Cherokee L's adaptive air suspension, most of the ones that you'll find are actually tuned towards the firmer side of things, Lincoln Aviator accepted there. So for instance, the available air suspension in the XC90 or the Q7, those are definitely firmer than the suspension tune that we find in this vehicle, even though they're riding on a cloud of air. As you'd expect out of a Cadillac, the cabin is certainly more isolated than the mainstream vehicles that are also built on this platform. I measured 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour, giving this an A when it comes to cabin noise. This is substantially similar to most of the European competition, although something like a BMW X5 is going to be a little bit quieter. Fuel economy has been pretty decent over a week of mixed driving. I've been averaging 21.5 mpg, which is just above the EPA rating. I largely credit this all-wheel drive system, which, if we move over to the tour mode, basically disconnects the rear axle from the equation. So this is going to feel very much like a front-wheel drive vehicle all the time, including if I come to a complete stop or just nearly a complete stop here, we're up on the throttle, we are going to get a bit of steering pull, a little bit of torque steer there, and possibly a little bit of front-wheel scrabble depending on the surface that you're on. Unlike some predictive or responsive all-wheel drive systems, when this is in the two-wheel drive mode, it is just in two-wheel drive mode for better fuel economy. If you want that predictive nature, you have to move this over to the other modes, mainly sport mode or all-wheel drive mode or the off-road mode. Those are going to send power to the rear when it's needed. If you're in just the regular all-wheel drive mode, it's going to try and bias the power to the front. It's not going to split 50-50. The sport mode and the off-road mode are going to send more power to the rear more often, definitely giving this a better traction feel. If you're looking for a spacious and well-appointed three-row crossover, the XT6 should absolutely be on your shopping list. Just be careful with options because it can get pretty expensive, especially if you need features like Cadillac Super Cruise, which honestly I would have to get on any new Cadillac because it is just super, super cool. This is not the absolute latest version of Super Cruise. You should keep that in mind. You will find that on the Escalade. This is one version behind in terms of its capabilities. Now, exactly how does this compare to the competition? For that, you're going to have to check over to part 2 of this video. There's going to be a link at the end of the video. Just click on the button on the lower right-hand side of your screen. There's also going to be a link down there in the description section to take you over there. But keep in mind that, again, as I'm driving it here, $72,000, and that is a little on the pricey side compared to the MDX, the XC90, even the Q7, the Lincoln Aviator, etc. This price tag ends up being quite large. I'll see you all over there in part 2. In the meantime, be sure and find me over at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social places, and of course, find me over at evbuyersguide.com as well. I'll see all of you later.